Hello, welcome to the Charles River Conservancy Parkland Show. My name is Renata von Charner. I'm the founder and president of the Charles River Conservancy. And these shows are about the river, about the parklands, and today it will be about the water and unfortunately some things that are in the water, which some people call sewage. And that is still a big issue. Even as we now start swimming in the river, we still have to be very watchful of what's in the river. And I have with me a guest who knows a lot about it. Well, welcome. Roger Frymire has been a volunteer for water testing for close to 20 years. And it's wonderful to have his expertise. Unfortunately, he's leaving town for Texas, but we will hear of how he has trained other people to do his work. And in 2005, the Boston Globe business section did an article about him, and he calls it the nose that knows. And they showed just his nose because his nose tells him what things are. So we will be looking at the river as we normally do. Today we will not be talking about the volunteer work or the skate park or the pathways, but we will be talking about the water, and we hope that we can swim in it soon. We were able to swim on it on the 12th of July of 2016, the fourth city splash. The tests were all excellent, but they are not always. So I'll be talking about sewage, stormwater. If we have time, we'll talk about cyanobacteria. But we will kind of start with the history of how sewage was regulated in the Charles and where we are today. So Roger, tell us maybe how you got started and what is the history of treating sewage in the Charles?
Let's go with the history, since we have this slide up. This is Boston, the peninsula, back in 1890. You can see little brown spots along the shoreline of the Charles River, and then in Back Bay and South Bay, larger brown areas. This is where sewage used to go straight into the waters surrounding Boston. But in 1890, they built the Boston Main Interceptor, which is a little thin red line on this running a couple of blocks away from the river, where they caught all of the sewage before it went to the river and pumped it around the peninsula to the south of Boston out to Nut Island. So it went away from the people living by the river in the pretty Back Bay. Unfortunately, every time there was a low tide, the mud flats stank to the high heavens because there was still sewage making it out of here whenever there was a rainstorm.
So should we now see how it looks now that the dam is built? And so that would be, the dam was operational in 1910. So is this map from about this period?
This map's a little later than 1910, but it does show where sewage is still going into the river basin. And unfortunately, the stink from the mud flats didn't go away because when they built the dam, then the river basin filled up with sewage. If there was a big thunderstorm, it just washed the sewage into the river, then it sat there. If there was a long, long rainstorm, it would flush on out into the ocean. But anytime there was a short, sharp storm, it would just pile up. And so you got a cesspool sitting between Cambridge and Boston.
So we see at the very top of the picture, we see the dam at the Museum of Science, where the Museum of Science now sits. So then it wasn't flushed out twice a day as it was before. It kind of just, as you say, just sat there.
It just sat there. So the legislature, 20 years after this, came up with a new fix, and they built another pipe even closer to the river. So in a rainstorm so big it overflowed that first pipe of sewage, this second pipe intercepted most of the sizes of rainstorm, and they shunted the water downstream of the Charles River Dam out into the ocean. So that caught the sewage and dumped it out of the Charles River Basin, except in the extremely large storms, 2 or 3 times a year.
Now, Roger, you have done a lot of, canoeing and kayaking to go and smell. You used your nose. And then when you would take samples, I think you often did take samples, what would you actually then do with those samples? And I think to the fact that you worked with EPA, that they helped you, I think is an interesting element of your volunteering.
Okay, a quick history of how I got into this. In about 1997 or 96, I started canoeing a lot on all the waters around Boston, and I lived 2 blocks away from the river at Magazine Beach. So the most frequent place I kayaked and canoed was right near my house. And whether I go upstream or downstream, almost everywhere I went, I could smell sewage and didn't like it. So I went to a symposium one day on the Boston Harbor cleanup that was held at the Kennedy School of Government. And as a handout, they had a list of all the different organizations and regulators that were doing work on the river and planning the cleanup. That's where, next time I went out and saw something I objected to, which was in front of MIT, there was a big underwater pipe, and these brown lumps of some sort were bobbing to the surface.
Yeah, not
and then
bad, yeah.
drifting downstream.
Yeah.
So I called up the Charles River Watershed Association and said, you might want to look at this. And they came and took a look, held their noses, and they took their own samples, took them to a lab, and had MIT and the city of Cambridge do something about that post-haste. I was impressed with how quick they responded, that they got a response, and this problem stopped. So I asked them, next time I see something, can I take samples? Can you train me? And they said, sure. We do sampling every month to get a baseline, but they didn't have a program for actually sampling individual pipes and trying to find the sources of their problems. So I thought, aha, that's what a volunteer can do. So I started doing research on old maps to see where there were pipes that people had forgotten about.
And that's the maps that we were looking at. You studied those maps.
Right, like this map, I think I got from the MDC.
Which was the predecessor of the DCR, yeah.
Yes, they were doing a poor enough job on keeping sewage out of the harbor that they had to have a lawsuit, the Boston Harbor cleanup lawsuit against the MDC. So the legislature decided the biggest problem was in funding this, and the MDC was too political, so they peeled off the sewage part of it and founded a separately funded commission, the MWRA, the Metropolitan...
A separate authority, really, yeah.
Yes, an authority
Yeah.
which had their own funding authority to set their own rates, and they were then under court order to come up with a cleanup. Now, all this comes about because of the 1974 Clean Water Act, which required the federal government, the EPA, to stop discharges from pipes into the waterways. They did this with a lot of manufacturers and industrial sources, and in the early 90s, they started requiring cities that had what's known as combined sewer overflows, places where they had unfortunately had one pipe system where all the stormwater goes into the sewer pipes, and since there's always a storm big enough to overflow any pipe you can build, then they would overflow sewage into the waterways.
Mm-hmm. Now, you have a map here that was kind of in preparation of the cleanup of the harbor. That might help us understand of how they prepared for the harbor cleanup, and that obviously then also was beneficial for the Charles.
Right. As part of the planning, they had to make up maps of all the cities together. You can see these red lines are the biggest sewer lines, And the dotted lines are overflows from those big sewer lines to the little red dots where they overflowed into the river. So there were a plan of how they could close the most of these they could and how they could minimize the amount of flow coming out of the ones that remained. This shows how big the problem was. About every tenth to a quarter of a mile along the river in Boston, there was sewage that pretty much every big rainstorm, every 3 or 4 weeks would flow into the river.
Now, it looks like there are many more problems along the Boston side, and the Cambridge side looks much better. It obviously is a big difference. Can you address that?
Part of that is just because Boston is older. Another part is that the places where there's a whole lot of problems tend to be the parts where Boston was filled in. It used to be under the ocean, and that landfill is fairly corrosive, and the pipes are old enough that they've started to deteriorate. And being at such a low level, because the landfill just barely got up above sea level, those pipes are always full of water. And that makes it very hard to trace the source of a problem. If you have sewage flowing into one of these pipes, but you only know that it's coming out at the outfall at the river, it's hard to trace up a full pipe to find where the problem is.
Yeah. Now, I interrupted you earlier when you were talking about the regulations. You were talking about the Clean Water Act. So there was the original Clean Water Act, and then there came consecutive regulations that came into power.
Yes, there were regulations of cities that had sewer overflows. The first round of those permits really just required them to find all their sewage overflows and map them out. It's called the NIPD system, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. So the idea is these permits are 5 years long. Every 5 years, they update the permit and make things better. So they had to map them and find them. Then
And they being the municipalities.
The municipalities.
Yeah.
And the MWRA, which was the MDC originally, which owned some sewer overflows. Then they were supposed to figure out how they can make things better. And they went through a couple more iterations of this permit, and it got to the early 1990s, and things were not getting better. So a Boston Harbor group and the Conservation Law Foundation had a citizens' lawsuit against the EPA to force them to enforce the Clean Water Act
That they originally had enacted.
So the next round of these permits said that there has to be a region-wide plan, and it took almost 10 years till about 1990, 1995 to come up with a complete plan for the metropolitan Boston area to eliminate, I think, 2/3 of all of the sewer overflow points and to minimize the amount of flow coming out of the remaining ones. They had an economic argument against closing all of them. They said that even if they closed all of them, they did a lot of sampling in their planning, even if they closed every single sewer overflow, the river would still have so much sewage in it because of stormwater outfalls that it wouldn't be any better if they closed all of them.
Now, when you say closing, if you close the outfall, does that mean you need to guide the liquid someplace else? Explain
Right.
of what the closing would mean.
To close a combined sewer overflow outfall, that means that you have to have some place for the excess water to go. You can either put a bigger pipe in to store it. You can put a bigger pipe in.
And that's, for instance, happening at Magazine Beach. There's a storage area there.
There's a small storage area, and there's a treatment area where they chlorinate the outflow, but it still overflows there 2 or 3 times a year, and it's still a CSO. So that's not actually closing them. To really close a CSO, you have to go back into the city and put in a separate stormwater pipe to take the clean stormwater and keep it as clean stormwater and make a new outfall to the river, or put in a new sewer pipe and route all of your sewage just to the sewer pipe.
And Cambridge has been doing a lot of that work over the last
Cambridge has done a lot of that.
few years.
Boston has done a lot of that. And the MWRA has done some of that. And now we come up against the economic argument. And about 10 years ago, when I started doing sampling, they said, well, the stormwater's still dirty. And I said, well, that's not legal for the stormwater to be dirty.
Dirty means it has sewage in it.
It means it has sewage
in it, yeah.
And you find that out by you either go, what I did was I sampled outfalls in wet weather and dry weather. And if they had a lot of E. coli, fecal bacteria, specifically from humans, human waste, you can smell it. If it's just 1% human waste, it's a very obvious odor. That's how I got my nickname of the nose that knows.
Yeah.
And besides that, you can see it. It's a gray, ugly, sometimes sudsy, looks like laundry water sometimes. Looks like your wash water. Well, it also has your sewage in it. Mm-hmm. And there's also floatables. Mm-hmm. There are hypodermic syringes that were coming out of these outfalls. Panty liners and condoms. There was one outfall, a stormwater outfall in front of Boston University, which had a big upwelling in the river off of the BU sailing changing dock. And one day I was out kayaking all the way down nearly to the New Charles River Dam, and I saw condoms, all these different colored condoms in the water, and they were sort of forming a line about 50 yards off the Boston shore. So I started following them, and I followed them for 2 miles upstream till I saw them bobbing to the surface, coming out of, well, it's called the Muddy River Conduit. It's about a 14 by 14 foot square outfall, which is supposed to be clean stormwater.
From the Muddy River?
Well, it's from a big area of Boston near the Muddy River, and when the Muddy River is near flood stage, it also overflows into this conduit, but it's mainly just a stormwater outfall for a big chunk of the city of Boston.
Is that the Stony Brook area that is?
That's south of Stony Brook, near Brookline, all along the South Brookline border is where this drainage area was.
Yeah. Well, we have a map here of the Cambridge drainage area, and maybe you want to help us understand this map, which is now about 20 years old, would you say?
Yes. This was when Cambridge was planning its part of the Boston Harbor cleanup, the CSO control plan. They mapped out the brown, tan parts of most of the city were combined sewer areas. Those areas, all of their stormwater was going into the MWRA sewer and adding in to the amount that overflowed at all of those overflow points. The red parts there were areas that were supposed to be separated, and all of their stormwater was going as clean stormwater to the Charles River. Unfortunately, the city of Cambridge found that that wasn't so when they did their studies, and those parts were still combined, and the stormwater outfalls were actually blocked, completely clogged at the river. So all that stormwater from about that half square mile down around Cambridgeport and Central Square was backing up and going into the sewers through routes that it found underground. There's always a weak spot.
Yeah. Now,
the city of Cambridge fixed those up around Fresh Pond, the blue areas, and just north of Harvard Square, another blue area, was also a combined area that they decided to separate. So most of these blue areas now in Cambridge have, as a part of the Boston Harbor cleanup, been separated, and their clean stormwater now goes either south to the Charles River or north to Alewife Brook. And the tan areas are still combined, but the city has done what it can in planning to remove even more of that area.
Yeah.
The city has plans to go beyond what was actually required under the Boston Harbor Cleanup Court Agreement.
Now, you mentioned the Clean Water Act. Now, what regulations are now in place that kind of refined that and went to the next stage?
Well, the Clean Water Act required that sewer outfalls be put on a schedule for fixing them. And more recently, the city of Boston was under what's called Phase 1 stormwater. In about 1985, they got their first stormwater permit, which required their stormwater to go under a similar plan and any problems with their stormwater outfalls to be fixed. And in about 1995, or actually closer to 2000, all the other cities, smaller cities in metropolitan Boston, were put under stormwater permits, NIPD's National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits. And the first round of those permits was very similar to the first round of sewer overflow permits. The cities were required to make a map of their system, to find all of their outfalls, and understand their system. They recently had the second round of the permit was updated, and that required a lot more. The city of Boston 5 years ago was sued by Charles River Watershed Association and the Conservation Law Foundation because they were not living up to their Phase 1 stormwater permit. They got the permit, they found that they had a lot of problems in their stormwater, especially with sewage, but things were not getting better. So there was a court suit and a federal agreement, and Boston Water and Sewer has been working very hard for 5 years now on fixing their stormwater problems. The main part of that agreement was they had to go to every one of their stormwater outfalls and sample it during wet weather and during dry weather.
And were you part of that sampling also?
Well, the comments that I made under the first stormwater permit, the renewal of the stormwater permit, everyone in the public has a chance to comment every time one of these permits comes up for renewal. And I take advantage of my opportunity to comment. And so...
And EPA used your data in that case. I mean, that was very important data.
Quite a bit of it. It showed that they had problems. It showed that their problems were specifically sewage. And in some cases, it showed that not just they weren't getting better, but there were places where things were getting worse. They were, which isn't good. They simply were not spending enough money every year to maintain their system and to fix it.
Yeah, well, we have one more map I want us to look at before, because I realize we could be talking about that for way more than our allocated 25 minutes. So give us an overview of what we're looking at now.
This is all of the yellow and other colored areas is the MWRA sewer area. The light tan are areas where people had separated stormwater. That's great. However, all the different colored areas, the dark blue are combined sewer areas, which are areas that are leading to combined sewer overflows. And especially bad are the red areas. The red areas are areas where the cities have separate pipes for sewage and for stormwater. You think that's great. The trouble is, they don't have their stormwater pipes going all the way to the river. Instead, their stormwater pipes are then dumped back into the sewers. So if you look up at Cambridge, the area around Fresh Pond, the big red lump to the north there, a large part of that, they have put in new outfalls to Alewife Brook now. And that separated area, which was adding to the overflows, is now not adding to the overflows.
So
The
this
area
map
around-
is a 1990 map, so things have
Right.
improved since then.
Quite a bit.
Yeah,
In
yeah.
Cambridge specifically. Cambridge is lucky because they're rich. They have a lot of commercial property, which they can tax at a high rate.
Mm-hmm.
And for a fairly compact city, they've been able to spend $20 to $30 million a year.
Mm.
Unfortunately, Boston has been spending $20 to $25 million a year.
Also, yeah.
But Boston has like 10 times the area.
The problem.
That's
Well,
why they were falling behind.
Yeah, well, Roger, you are going to leave town, which is a huge loss for water quality, for the river, for all of us. And you
I recommend that anyone that's interested in getting the river cleaner get trained by the Charles River Watershed Association to do sampling. Then when you're out walking along the river or paddling along the river, if you see something that stinks,
yeah,
if you see something, a floatable, a condom, a hypodermic, especially something coming out of a pipe, if you see a gray, ugly flow coming out from a head wall or from a pipe, call up the Watershed Association and report it. You can call the EPA or the DEP direct and report these things.
yeah. And you have also trained students from Northeastern under Ferdy Hellberger, who has been on this show. So it's wonderful you've done that. But we are coming to the end of our show. So this has been wonderful. And as I realize we need to have other people from the Watershed Association talk about the continuation of that battle that you fought, but you have done a lot, and we're very grateful for all the work you have done over the years on that. And I
hope people understand just a little bit more about the river's problems and the fact that they're getting better. Believe me, things smell a lot better than they did 20 years ago when I first went canoeing.